Just a brief recap. Are we turned on speaker?
Yes.
Brief recap. We set this meeting as a supplementary budget meeting to see the paperwork after some of the changes that we discussed a week ago, including some additions to the capital budget as a result of recommendations or suggestions from the Finance Committee, which were well-researched and documented and forward-thinking. And also, we had hoped to have updates on a lot of the background financial information by tonight that would allow us to have an intelligent discussion about final tweaks to the budget before we go into the fourth and final budget review a week from tonight. Since we decided to set this meeting on Friday, we got some news that the auditors, who are behind, found some apparently errant journal entries, not from the current fiscal year that we're in right now, but from the prior fiscal year, FY 2024. And that has thrown some of our baseline data into a bit of a tailspin. So Vika and Andrew and others in the town office, along with the auditors, have been scrambling to give us the best information we can get in order to finalize the budget. That's my take on where we are as of 6 o'clock tonight. Anything to add to that?
No, other than unless the board has specific questions about the changes that came forth from last week. It happened Friday afternoon, and I did email you with some basic information, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to follow up on any of it.
So any questions from the board that are specific to what the auditor reported last Friday? Carol?
Well, I thought you had said at the previous meeting that there were some issues with prior entries, right? So that wasn't new information.
It is new information in terms of the impact of finalizing 2024 audit. The start of the 2024 audit, there were journal entries that needed to be made from fiscal year 23 to make sure that numbers were aligned according to the audit and what was in trio. And so that was done. This information is when they received all of the town's audit information and started going through to make sure that every number lined up and all of the bank reconciliations were accurate based on the journals that were posted and the descriptions in all of the different expense accounts and general ledgers. There was a discrepancy that was found in June of 2024, which is the very last month of fiscal year 24. The journal entry that was missed was a positive impact to the town because it's cash that was received that wasn't reported. But then a journal entry that was made subsequent to that had an impact on what the starting number for fiscal year 25 should have been. And so I don't have a good answer for it. I don't understand it until the auditors look at what the reconciliation should have been and provide the accurate corrections that we need to make. What I'm unable to recognize is how we were able to reconcile in fiscal year 25 for a number of months when there was a inconsistency in the number that we used from fiscal year 24 into July of 25. So what that puts us in the position of is when we are able to make the proper corrections based on the fiscal year 24 audit and the reconciliation adjustments that need to be made, we have to go through all of the months and reconcile each month to make sure that the information is absolutely accurate and current. And so we could start out by going by each month and seeing if there is anything missed and what the differences are. we're not looking at like hundreds of thousands. It's probably gonna be more like $10,000 to $15,000, $20,000 difference. At this point, it's looking in the benefit of the town, but I don't know all of the information and how the numbers are going to align, and so I don't have any better answer than that, unfortunately.
So is there, I mean, the question we asked last week was, can't they give us an estimate of the undesignated fund?
I asked that again on Friday, and the answer that was provided to me was no, and I said, why? And she said, similar to what I'm saying right now to you, where she just, with the position she's in, she doesn't feel comfortable providing a number unless it's on a document that says it's a draft.
Dave?
All of the information that you've provided us, and I know they're estimates, are they estimates based on which,
The current numbers as they stand.
as they stand? So
Correct.
chances are they're going to get better if,
The
we don't know.
first unreconciled, unposted item that was discovered from June 2024, there was a $10,000 and change. It was money that was received that wasn't properly recorded. And
Right.
so that's the only thing that we've been able to pinpoint a number, but until they go through all of the different documents, so on Friday, what I did is I sent them more supporting documents of all of the reconciliation and photocopies of a lot of the information that frankly, I don't understand why they didn't already have, because she came in and scanned a lot of documents, but all the supporting documents, so they've started looking at all of the details that go behind the reconciliation.
so would you say the chances are it's only going to get better, or you just don't know at all?
I don't feel comfortable answering at all. All I could say is right now there are inconsistencies, and unfortunately I wish I wasn't sitting here and telling you otherwise.
Of course. Thank you.
Other questions about what we heard from the auditor?
Is it just in one line item at this time?
So bank reconciliation is bank reconciliation, so it could be one general ledger, but at the end of the day, it's the cash account that is thrown off, and that's,
Okay. As such a ripple effect. Thank you.
it could.
So the spreadsheet that Vika sent out earlier today, which I believe is the spreadsheet that's in the stack of papers in front of us all, correct? Has the spreadsheet document, which is output from Trio, shows revenue and expense equal. That's the goal of this whole exercise, is to get to a point where revenue equals expense. And the way we do that,
I'm sorry, Bob, I'm not following you.
if you look at the total revenue number,
So what page are you on?
Yeah, we're,
And does the public have a copy?
the finance
Richard
committee,
doesn't have a copy.
I put 5 on the table.
yep,
Page 38
page 38,
is the expense total.
right, and
Then
page 43 is the revenue total. And you'll note they're the same number on this spreadsheet, which is output from what is in Trio currently. And the way those get to be the same number is by plugging the undesignated fund balance use number, which we had previously had identified at 250K. That's been dropped in this spreadsheet to 175K. And the other plug is the tax commitment. So those are the two plugs that make revenue equal expense. In the version of the spreadsheet that you're looking at, which has in it, if I understand correctly, the additional 165K that we added to capital last week based on the ideas from the finance committee, and which has in it the undesignated fund balance transfer or usage at 175K, not 250. And the total budget, when added up through the sheet that we didn't have last week, that we have this week, in the version you're looking at, equals a just under 10% tax increase. So I would describe that as unacceptable. And for me, the work in front of us, to me, it seems like, how do we get that down to a number that the board agrees is a reasonable number for us to propose to the taxpayers? Does the board want that to be 0? Does the board want that to be 25%? Does the board want that to be 5%, 3%? That's our work tonight, is to make changes in revenue or expense, but most likely in expense tonight, to get us down to an expected average tax increase that's acceptable to the board. Does that sound right to you, Rika, in terms of our work tonight?
I would say that, and then if the board has any follow-up questions or specific things relative to the entire budget as a whole.
Yeah. Carol?
So I do have a question before we get into the budget. Because Vika, you sent some responses to my questions, which I did copy for the board on. The one before we get into it, I just wanted to understand the undesignated fund situation, because I see it differently, and I just want to be sure. And I remember this came up with John last year, so I just want to be sure I'm clear. So the last number that we have, that we know is, I hope is correct, for the undesignated fund is 638 at the end of fiscal year 23, right?
That was the audited number, so that's, yes,
So
that's the last
at the end
number.
of fiscal year 2023, we know we had, like, in the bank, 638,000. So then in fiscal year 24, we allocated 200,000 to reduce the tax burden. In fiscal year 25, we allocated 250,000. That's this current year. And then we're proposing 175,000 for fiscal year 26. So that's a total of 625,000. And admittedly, there was some left over in the budget, potentially 24 and 25, but we don't know what that is. So I guess so you had only said 250 and 175, but there's actually 200 that goes back, unless I'm mixed up. Yes.
That was my confusion last year. So if you look at the 2023 audit, page 11,
Yeah,
where you get the
Yeah.
638, 200 is assigned, and then there's 638 unassigned. The 200, to my understanding, was the 200 that was approved at the town meeting to be used in fiscal year 24.
oh. Is that your understanding?
No, so we did verify this last year. The 200 number, the 638 was the undesignated fund number in total after that 200.
Yeah, that's what I tried to
That's what you
say.
just said.
I agree.
So, yeah, so then the 638 number was the number that was used last year to determine, because it was the audited, what the anticipated number of undesignated fund the board could move forward with. With how I was taught and how I double checked on through this process, especially with all the questions, is if you have the audited number to work with and you're using that number, to help you determine, and you're using that audited fiscal year, the fiscal year that you're in expense number to then come up with what your percentage rates are. If you don't have an audited number, the best thing that you can work with is, and like I said, this is how I was taught and how I, double check to make sure this is accurate is, so in the email that I sent you this afternoon, the expense that you're using for the budget, where you're then taking certain things out of it, like contingency, like debt, things like that. And then the number you come up with at the bottom line, that's the number that then you're using between 16 and 25. So because we don't have the audit, we're using the proposed, I don't know how many of you have the email in front of you or not. So what you're using is you're using the fiscal year 25 budget number, and because that's the most recent budget you have. And then you're subtracting select board contingency, capital, debt, school contingency, school debt, and then that dollar number that you have left, you're figuring out what those numbers are within 16 and 25 to stay within the town policy for the undesignated fund balance. The number that you're using is the most, the closest audited number to give you a general idea in hope that it is, give or take, similar. You're basically taking an assumption, doing that. So in this case, we took fiscal year 25 expenses, subtracted things, and then we're using the last known audited number, which is the 638.
Got that. So the number we know is 638. So then we're guessing at, so I guess what maybe I misunderstood your email, but what I read was we took out the 250 that we used for this current fiscal year.
Correct.
And then we took out 175 that we're proposing to use, and we looked at the balance left after that, right?
No, so I took the expense, the budget expense, and the total number ended up being a little over $2.3 million. And then I looked at what is 16% of that, and then what is 25% of that. And then you take the most current audited number you have, and then you use that number. I understand that you've got the 250 from last year, but this is where you're ultimately kind of, you could take the 250 subtracted from it and see where you get left if you want to be really conservative. But that's not,
I guess I'm just not, the most conservative thing would be to say the last number we knew was 638, let's take the 425 from that, but I mean, I agree that's ultra conservative. So where I'm having trouble understanding is how you're dealing with and I'm sorry if I'm wasting people's time,
No.
but I just don't quite understand. I was just trying to pull the email up so that.
so the fiscal, I guess, I'll run it from the start to finish, and then.
Because I mean,
maybe-
if I'm assuming, does everybody else understand this
Well, can I offer something? Is it in the way you were taught? So what we've described to date is taking that number from a couple years ago, subtracting what we used from undesignated funds last year, and subtracting what we're proposing to use this year. I think that ignores what will have been added to undesignated funds in the current year.
correct.
Right.
Yes.
So that's the ultra conservative part of it. We can assume that nothing was added in the current fiscal year to undesignated funds. Or, I think the way Vika was taught relies on an assumption that you assume that a similar amount was added, or
Well, that's-
something less than a similar amount was added.
That's the part I'm not understanding. So I get that. I get the most conservative thing is just to say, we haven't added anything and we subtract the amounts from last year and this year.
Yes.
Clear. What I don't get is how you're getting to the estimate of kind of how much you're adding. And I get how you calculate the
Yeah,
range.
and I'm not adding anything, so basically, and this is where this is, in some ways, I don't feel like it makes sense, but this is just how apparently town managers tend to provide the anticipated undesignated fund balance. So, the total number, the 2.37 million, so you take our current fiscal year that we're in, we're taking the expense combined budget between the school and the town, you're subtracting school contingency and debt, you're subtracting select board contingency, you're subtracting capital, you're subtracting debt services, which bond bank payments, which brings you then after those subtractions, it's $2.378 million. 16% of that is $380,000, 25% of that is $594,000. Where does that $600,000 fall? And that's,
I get that the 16 to 25% is what the policy is for us to have in the designated fund as a select board.
yes.
So I get that.
So what I took is I took the most recent audited undesignated fund number we have, which is the $638,000 from fiscal year 23 audit.
Yep.
And I subtracted $175,000 from it. And the number that was left, where does that put you? Between 16 and 25. And that's the best way that I know how to, and the best way that I was taught to anticipate the undesignated fund, because you're assuming that it's gonna be similar to the audited number that you have. Ideally, you would have the audited number, but this is, so the previous years where we didn't have an audited number like we did last year, this is the exact same equation we used to come up with an anticipated number.
And I guess I understand now the reasoning, so you're ignoring the 250,000 in a sense,
Yeah,
and saying that, you know, we had enough left over before, so we should have enough left over this time. I think that's kind of the thinking, I think.
and so,
But I guess we're, you know, because these are much larger numbers than we've used in the past for undesignated fund allocations, I guess, you know, I guess maybe one thing that would be helpful to me is in fiscal year 23, how much did we have left over from the town budget? In other words, does that question make sense to you? You know what I mean?
it does. So what was the actual from what was the budgeted? I can get you those numbers.
So I understand now what you're saying. It's basically you're only looking at this undesignated fund allocation.
And that's, so in the other part is if you don't have the audited number, you're using the current fiscal year budget
Right.
to come up with that window.
Yep.
And so with fiscal year 24, we, especially even with all of the issues that we just came across, we know that we didn't exceed the budget. We know that we were under from what the total budget. So there is going to be rollover of funds, which is why if you're stuck in this situation, you're using the current fiscal year budget numbers.
I get that, but it kind of assumes sort of a steady, you know, undesignated fund overage versus the expenditures, and 250 was a lot. So I guess, you know, yeah, without the audit, it's hard to tell, but I understand the reasoning now, and it wasn't clear, I'm sorry. I get where the 16 to 25%
Yep.
comes from, but what I the strategy of using our plan for this year to sort of figure out if we're in the right percentage from 2 years ago is a little unsettling.
I understand.
John?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. That's the problem I had last year. Last year I was off by the 200 because I didn't realize the auditors had already taken that into account as we started fiscal year 2024. But to me, it's 638 minus 250 minus 175, if that's what you want to use. You compare that to the 16 to 20 range. You could add, if you want, the difference between revenue in fiscal year 24 and expenditures, and you could estimate again 25. And that's the way to do it from my perspective, if you're going to do estimation. To simply subtract the 175 from the 638 makes no sense to me.
I would concur with that. That $250,000 coming out last time, in fact, there's another $15,000 that we took out, something in that same town meeting, I think, out of the undesignated fund balance in a later article. It's not a big number. But, and maybe this is what you said, we're all saying sort of similar things here in different perspectives. It's hard to get your head around. But at the end of the last fiscal year, we had a budget amount and an actuals amount that we must know pretty closely in terms of the way we track the budget anyways. That's a better number than 0 to say how much is left in the previous fiscal year. So you've got to kind of do a balance. You've got to kind of do an account balance with reasonable estimates that are taken from something. And it's either taken from your budget versus actuals, plus your known decreases from the town meeting minutes. That only happens in the town meeting minutes, so you know that they're all there. And they should all get moved to some account somewhere, so it's not like we shouldn't be spending that 250, it got spent. And also the 175 is gonna get spent because you are putting it back in the revenue stream.
So that's where I don't agree. And I think, correct me for thinking this if I'm thinking wrong, but when you say the 250 that we moved in is going to get spent,
It's spent the moment you apply to revenue.
I would argue that that's wrong. I would argue that it gets spent when you write a check to pay somebody. So let me finish, please. When we finalize the budget and the town votes to approve it, that's approved a budget. That money isn't spent until the check gets written. And what I think is missing for me in what John described is what was budgeted for fiscal 25 that didn't get spent.
Well, let me ask this question to follow up on that point. Vika, does a journal entry get created to move $250,000 from undesignated fund balance into some area?
Yes.
That's your spending.
It's not spending it, that's putting it into the budget, or it gets spent.
It gets taken out of the
It gets taken out of the undesignated fund.
That's not
No, it's
spending.
gone.
It's
So in
no
order
longer
to
in
do
the
that,
undesignated
the
fund.
calculations we're talking about right now, from that perspective, a journal article has moved it out of the undesignated fund, it's not in there anymore.
So,
But
I'm
what
just-
about what got added?
That,
I've already said-
what gets added is the difference between, at the end of that year, the difference between the budget and the actual.
Yeah.
And you're missing both of those pieces in this calculation you're doing right now.
Well, is it missing in the recommended calculation that Vika is describing? That is what town managers use. That's my question to
Sounds
Vika.
like it is.
I think if we were 1 year behind, it wouldn't be quite as bad, but I mean, if you didn't have, I mean, for me, we're talking really 2 years, is how I see it. And so in order for this to have been a wash, we would have had $250,000 unexpended in the previous in fiscal year 24, right, for it to be a wash. And if we did, then that calculation you just did can, to me, maybe give me feel a little more comfortable. But that's a lot to have left over. It's possible that's what it was, but as I kind of agree that this number is generally knowable, like we should be able to come up with an estimate ourselves and the reason we're kind of spending so much time on this is ultimately what's going to impact the tax rate, I think.
Mhm.
And so it wouldn't be such a big deal, except it's how we're going to, reduce the tax rate. So because 250 is the biggest number we've ever put towards the undesignated fund, and I just don't know myself if the budget had that much left over. It seems like a lot to have left over, but I think we should be able to figure out how much that is, right?
For your budget versus actuals near the end of last year, it should tell you. Seems entirely knowable, but, I mean, within
Within a,
Within a-
reasonable range.
no, yeah.
And I think if you can tell us that because you've provided all that information to the auditors already, right?
For fiscal year 24?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then for fiscal year 25, we should be able to make we did this, I think it was last year, we did sort of a guesstimate, and I'm okay doing a guesstimate when we have the previous year, but when we have, we're missing 2 years, really.
If I may, I think the thing that's disquieting this is that it's such a big number.
Yeah.
Carol said it, but I mean, that's what's setting
The
me up.
250?
The 250 is a very big number to have left over, a very big number to be putting 200 a year before that. Those are fairly big numbers. When we have $800,000 in the undesignated fund balance, $600,000 to $800,000 before we do that, theoretically. It's just a big number. It means that, and that needs to inform the budget process that we're talking about right now.
Right.
By saying the budget's going up 10%, if we still got $250,000 left over, then take that percent out. Because we don't need it.
So,
Budget, you mean?
A point,
We're over budget.
your statement, I think when you say budget, you mean expense?
Well, yeah,
In the sentence you just, so,
take it from the expense.
there are two ways that $250,000 could have been left over. One is that we budgeted expenditures when we were planning the budget that we wound up not spending, right? That's the way you're talking about. The other, and I think this is legitimate, I think this is a real number, is revenues that were in excess of what we budgeted revenues to be. We know in the past year our revenues have been higher than they were budgeted. So those two
Yeah.
are what comprises the 250.
Sure.
So, do you have access to a recap now of, at the end of fiscal '24, what was the difference between
Budget and the actual.
budget and actual for both expense and revenue? Okay. Can you?
Yes, I do. And what I'll do is, first thing tomorrow, I'll look at those numbers and I'll.
Oh, you don't have it now?
The one day I didn't bring the computer that I would have access to that.
Okay.
I don't have it now, but I can generate the information and then I can email you all the information so you could see what that
Okay.
difference is.
So in simple terms, to me, we were building up the undesignated fund, and then we start, and if you look back through the history of the use of that fund, it's only been recently that we put in these large expenditures out of the undesignated fund, mostly to bump up the capital. I mean, it was a good idea, but if we're not replacing it at the same rate that we've been dumping it out, then we could get into some trouble. And I think we're gonna have more and more capital expenditures coming, so I feel like we need to get a pretty good handle on this. That's how I feel, and I do agree, and I think a couple other people have said it, if we need to, then we really should be going back and looking at the actual budget. And if we have $200,000 left over at the end of the year, maybe we should be reducing some of these budgetary.
Again, if we have 200,000 left over, it's possible that we over budgeted expenses, but it's also possible that we under budgeted revenue.
What's our total revenues, not counting taxes?
Last year it was in the $500,000 range, this year it's in the 600.
Yeah, I would see that it's possible. But,
I'm not saying it's all of it, I'm saying it's part of the picture that we need to look at. We can't just look at how we performed actual versus budget expenses. We have to look at both. The fact that it went from 500 revenue one year to 600 the next year, I think is a significant fact.
maybe, I guess the other thing that, I guess where I'm coming from is what I'm concerned that that we don't put property owners in a position where when we get to one of these big capital projects, that we're gonna kill them with taxes. And I think the reality is we know we're gonna have to have some substantial tax increases for those projects. So if we were already building in these other tax increases, 10% is big. And, so I think we could really drive people out of here. And that's what my concern is. So I think the revenue is going up in part maybe because the assessment value, I guess that's the other part when you say, is this just fees that are going up? And I did see that we built in some higher fees into the fiscal year, higher revenues into fiscal year 25. So the net budget may still be going up. So, the net versus, to me, it's partly the net versus that matters. And really, the tax calculation takes the net. It's really trying to come up with the difference, the taxes for the net difference, right?
Yes, yeah, and so the tax commitment, you're taking, and the document, the municipal tax rate, you're basically taking all of the information and you're putting it into that system, and it, based on the information you put in, what the school education is, what the municipal expense is going to be, what the Cumberland County expense is going to be. You take all those things, you plug them in, and then it generates you a number that then you verify that needs to be raised by taxes. And so then you take that number, you put it under the tax commitment and revenue, and that's how all of those revenues, the undesignated fund and the anticipated tax commitment number is how you get revenue and expense too.
So one thing we can see is that over the past 5 years in particular, our total taxable valuation has gone up significantly, which in some cases our mill rate has gone down to generate the same amount of money. But so I think that's, and I think Jackie had said that she was bumping it up on average 10% a year to kind of, but then we're gonna have a revaluation that's gonna give us a more real number, and we don't wanna find out there's a 40% differential because, again, people won't be able to pay.
Right.
That's what other towns are dealing with. So I think there's a lot of aspects to balance here, and what we really do care about is the net, I think.
Well, I don't think anybody, I don't want to speak for the board, I'm certainly not interested in putting forth a 10% tax increase. I think we have to change the budget in order to bring that down to something more palatable. I don't know what that number is, but it's right in my mind, 10%. And we can do that by decreasing expenses. I don't think we can do it by increasing revenue at this point, because revenue at this point, the only things we have to play with, we have what we think is an accurate budget for revenues. The two items to play with are the undesignated fund balance and the tax commitment. And the tax commitment is the plug number at the end, so we can't adjust that other than to set what we want the tax rate to be. Dave?
Yeah, I hear the number 10% being bandied about here, and I'm looking at Vika's memo here, and she's saying the current rate is 10.72. It could go up to 11.77, which is a 1.05% increase. Not,
Take 11 and divide it by 10, Dave, that's the
Why?
10%.
wait, you do, well, the actual rate, though, is only going up 1.05.
That's inaccurate.
The difference between 1177 and 1072.
That's the number of mills that are going up, but the percent increase is the old mill divided by it's the new mill divided by the old mill.
Okay, so you're saying that.
1.05 is what percent of 10?
Yeah, that's the
10%.
point. Okay, so
That's where the 10% comes from.
that's where the 10% is coming
So if you're
from.
paying $5,000 in taxes, you're paying $500 the next year.
It's gonna raise my taxes $480.
10% would, yeah.
But I think, to that point, Bob, to me, I feel like so we have 175 in there, 1,000 for the undesignated fund. If we took the undesignated fund out totally, our tax rate increase would be, I don't know, closing in on
15%.
15.
15?
Yeah.
Okay.
If we took out the 175.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's why that number to me is important to get pretty comfortable with, that we have a reasonable estimate, because that affects the bottom line on the
Right.
tax rate. That's,
Conversely, if we take out the 165,000 of additional capital expenditures that we added last week, it goes from 10 down to 5.8.
I think okay, that's what you're recommending?
That's one avenue that I think we have to consider. The other avenue is to go through line by line, department by department, and look for ideas where we can save 3,000 here, 10,000 there, or both. Or
1 year as a board, we simply directed the town administrator to lower every department by 10%. We lived,
yeah.
don't even notice.
The answer I would have to that, the primary direction that we heard from voters a year ago was invest in your staff, build up your staff, get capable people in positions like all the different staff within the departments of the town, like the code officer, and we have invested in those things. I think it would be a bit of a whipsaw to throw 10% at the whole department and follow that approach. That just sounds to me too much like what's going on in Washington right now. I'd like it to be more thoughtful.
Just call me Doge.
Get along, little doggy. Yeah. Mark?
Okay, could I ask you to state your previous statement about the capital list that you just said?
In the context of what Carol was saying, if we eliminated the use of 175,000 from the undesignated fund balance, that would take tax increase from the current 10% to about 15. And John's done that calculation as well. Conversely, if you look at the current 10% with the budget worksheet that we have in front of us, last week when we met with the finance committee, there were several recommendations that were based on hard work and logical analysis that make sense to add.
Paving, fire, rescue.
Those things,
So on and so forth.
Yep. And all I said was, as opposed to saying, let's make the tax increase bigger by pulling out the 175K, so taking it from 10 to 15, we could pull out the 165K of capital that we added, which would pull it from 10 down to 5. I'm not proposing we do that. I'm just saying those are the thoughts that I have as to what do we need to look at to get the tax increase down to a more reasonable number. We could also take money, for example, from the amount that we've added to the stone pier. I think that would be a big mistake because to some degree, adding that number is what gives us the basis for the applications for CDS money that we just submitted.
Yeah.
We said we were adding that. We said we were fairly confident that this town would vote to approve that 300,000 additional money on top of the 630 that we have now.
Yeah.
So I would advocate against pulling that out, but those are all possible changes we could make to get us down to a reasonable tax increase.
So if I may.
Yep.
I would consider not funding those extras that the finance committee brought last week, including paving. And I could explain further, but I think you know I can talk about paving all night long. We can wait a little bit longer on some stuff on South Road, because we're not gonna be able to get the work done right away anyway. And I would advocate that the board strongly consider directing the town administrator to come back with a reasonable attempt at the departmental operational section of the budget with at least a 4 or 5% cut. That's my statement from that.
4 or 5% from each department or for the overall aggregate?
I don't know what that means. I think it means total, but this department might be able to lose a little bit more than this department, so on and so forth. You know what I mean?
Yep, agreed. Yep. The other possibility, I think, is we could recommend the movement of some money out of existing reserve accounts into other reserve accounts instead of funding them from tax increase. For example, if we had $100,000 in a fund that was aimed at tree removal, we could recommend moving that $100,000 out of tree removal and applying that to the stone pier. So I'm just trying to say we've got a lot of places we can look to find the money. And I'm not proposing that we do any of them at this point. I'm just saying we have options to look at.
Yep.
Chip, please.
Yeah, just my observation. On the spreadsheet, our recommendation was a lot less than showed up on the spreadsheet for the town. And I think, me personally, and I can't say this for John, I mean, I'm representing myself, maybe I'm just taking out my finance committee hat. But I know more than I did 6 months ago. There's a lot of stuff in that that's coming up. And if people are asking me to be honest with the town and tell them what they've got to look towards, we can play shell games with money all over the place. You can call it revenue or negative revenue or whatever you want to call it. But eventually, and this isn't talking about the big stuff. This is talking about the 70 assets that you have. Or I started riding my electric bike and I'm looking at the roads and they're right. So I think if I'm being honest with people, I've spent, I did that. We were given, it was clear that there was no structure. We were given a spreadsheet with no formulas in it. It was essentially a Word document. So the town was operating, not looking at what it's going to take to replace those things in the future. And if you start pulling money out of reserve accounts, that changes the spreadsheet. So if I'm being honest and people ask me honestly what it is, I'm the one who did the spreadsheet. There's a lot coming up. Not next year, not 3 years, but as you look at that, has anyone looked at the spreadsheet? Let's not do a hand raise. But I know I got no questions from anybody on the spreadsheet, which means two things. Either people didn't look at it, or I made a perfect spreadsheet. It has 3,000 cells in it. There's no way it was perfect. So if you're asking me, the guy that made the spreadsheet, based on what you gave us for information, and with John's information, I would not be honest saying, we didn't even give you the full amount that's on the spreadsheet. If you go and look at the spreadsheet, you'll see what's there.
So you're saying, I think, that if we followed the implications of the entire spreadsheet, then what the finance committee would have been recommending is not adding 165K. It would be recommending adding a lot more than 165.
Right.
Yeah.
That was
So
the introductory low cost.
Yeah.
step into the firm.
Well, we were trying to be realistic
Yeah.
based on the
No,
information you
that was
give
clear
us.
in the spreadsheet and also in the presentation, it's quite
But,
clear,
no, and yes, thank you for that, but based on your town that you're working on those spreadsheets, we were looking at that saying, okay, what's a reasonable thing? Because in the end, the question that you have to answer is, how much can people afford to raise taxes? That, you should start with that, and move backwards from that, rather than play shell games and
I
push the
agree.
money around and push it forward. The important slide on that presentation that we did shows the CPI for, basically, we did a lot of research to try and look at that, and what you actually raise taxes with versus what inflation
What's
did.
the
And at this point,
computer price of it?
you're 8% less
Right.
than if you had followed inflation.
Right.
So it's, I mean, I'm just being honest
No, I
about
agree.
that there's, I couldn't not say it, that as you do all these calculations.
Thank you for saying
That's
it.
it.
And I want to add one thing to Chip. You said the thing we have to be concerned with is not raising taxes. And I agree, we have to be concerned with that this year. I think to a point Carol made earlier, we also have to look at what are the implications of the decisions that we make today on the taxpayer 1 year down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. If we're not investing.
Yeah, no, eventually your decision is going to be based on how much you think the town is willing to pay.
Yeah.
In a decision like that, that's after 15 elements in a formula. I would start with that. And you can move backwards from that. So my point is just simply, there's a lot more out there that we saw. It could not have been looked at in the method that we did it based on the spreadsheets that you were using, or anyone was using. And I don't blame VK one bit for that. I mean, the system is very flawed.
Yep. Sure. Thanks, Chip.
So to that point, I kind of feel like it's, some of these expenses are required and inevitable that we weren't really accounting for, and sort of to go and reduce those expenses, or it's not even fully representative of the true cost, is kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, and we maybe should be looking back to the operational budget to find some economies, because in a sense, I think that we can't afford to keep increasing the operational budget if we have these other costs that we know we're gonna incur. That's kind of my mindset on this. And, I think too that we aren't even really, I did call John after I got the call about the, how much money could we come up with to support the stone pier, and we can do that, but then you start adding on some of the other projects, and it starts getting a little daunting, and you start looking at significant tax increases. So, I think, I think we can't start cutting out some kind of required expenses, and we really need to maybe use a little more discipline looking back at our departmental operational budgets and really make sure that we, are operating as reasonably lean as we can, because those are ongoing costs. They don't generally go down.
So Carol, when you say the cost that we need to not ignore, you're referring to capital, to things.
Capital, but these are kind of maintenance costs, and so we got the big capital like the stone pier and other things, but
You're referring to things that are in the capital budget, not in the operations.
but
not-
they're kind of, fire trucks.
Right, in the capital budget,
Right.
not things that are in the departmental budgets, other than capital.
Well, there's the big capital and the medium capital.
Right.
I'm talking the medium capital, which we haven't really been dealing with. We've been very focused on the big capital to some extent. We have kind of ignored those. And so I think that's part of what I'm talking about. So I think I'm not comfortable just ignoring the recommendations made by the finance committee, because they don't even represent the full potential cost.
Right.
If I understand it correctly.
That's right.
And they said that when they brought it back to us.
One other thing too is another one of those slides to keep in mind for some of the big things is that there are the bonding issues and John's done a lot of work on future bond capacity. So there is some good news. One of those slides has some good news that things are going.
But the other thing is, it's better to, if I understood somebody on the finance committee, putting the money away is a lot cheaper than borrowing it down the line. So like, we kind of want to try to do as much of that as we can and still function, rather than, trying to borrow it all.
Yeah, I think that's right, but we've done a little more work since some of those conversations, and when you look at present value, future dollars, et cetera,
Yeah.
it gets closer.
Yeah.
So one place you could postpone a little bit would be like fire trucks, that you're gonna put a 25-year bond on, if you can bond a fire truck for 20 years. Rather than save, you might say, okay, we're gonna bond the fire trucks in 2038 and 2043. But
I have to say, I'm not feeling very optimistic about big chunks of change coming in for the stone pier in the time frame that we are gonna need to do something. And so that, I think, is just a
Big
reality.
one.
And the project we're talking about is much smaller than what the community is expecting, top off. So, right, so I mean, it's kind of, to do for what the community is expecting is
Yeah.
probably not easy.
Would you mind if I said one quick thing about
Go
capital?
for it.
I asked John after the meeting last week, a week before, whenever it was, about specifically the recommendation of, I think it was 35,000 towards replacement of an ambulance fund. The reason I asked him that question is the ambulance is pretty new, and we bought it for 2.5 years early because of the recommendation from the fire department, and we had almost enough money to purchase it. We took some money out of another account and we purchased it. And I'm not saying you shouldn't stop planning for anything on a 10-year plan, whatever it is, but I guess that's one that I could pretty much say, the ambulance is almost brand new. We have a backup ambulance. We're not in a terrible situation if we have to wait another couple of years or a year and a half when our debt gets retired from Cumberland and eases up a little bit on the payment there. Thank you.
Chip, did you have something?
Well, just, that was one of the surprises in the spreadsheet, is what we did, basically, all we had to work on was, we have an ambulance, we bought it for X amount, we expected, based on the auditor's depreciation schedule, which who knows where that came from, but that's all we could work on. So we expect to have to buy that in 10 years. So in the spreadsheet, it has a variable of the inflation rate and the amount your money would earn when it's in the savings account. It's really surprising. Now, you're exactly right. So the money's going to have to be put away a little bit if you want to buy that in 10 years, because you expect if you pay $100,000, it's going to be $100,000. So that's why you need to start putting away the money. But you can certainly look at that spreadsheet, and the most important thing that could be done with that to change it is to change the next purchase date.
Right.
You can say, we don't need to buy it in 10 years. We're going to push that out to 15. We couldn't do that. Somebody from the town has to research that and change that. And that could have a big effect on it.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. So at this point, there have been several ideas put out there as to how we move forward. I believe, looking at the schedule, the 14th is when we approve the warrant. Our fourth and final budget review is a week from tonight. Is that accurate, Deacon?
Yes.
Okay. So we've had a couple of ideas, like have the TA go back and look at departments and look for reductions in operating expense in the departments. Personnel, outside services, materials, things like that. That's one suggestion. Another suggestion has been that we look at the capital budget again, now that we know what the tax impact is. And another suggestion was to look at actual versus budget for both expense and revenue from FY 2024 to see how things ended up. If we had the TA look at the operating budgets department by department, and if the TA brought us back that actual versus budgeted for both expense and revenue for FY 2024, does the board think that'll give us the information we need to finalize the budget next week?
I would hope so, but what I want to also say is I look at a couple of things. I think when I look at the economy and concerned about what increases we can anticipate for a year from now, that's intimidating when we're talking about some of these increases that we're seeing with our present economy. The other thing that really has stuck with me is just how important having these capital investments are, because it seems like we have really big things that we need to be prepared for, and how much it costs to bond versus save when we're looking at what we really need to do for the stove here, but also what happens if another truck blows up or something big happens. So I don't know, I guess I think, and then I'm also trying to weigh in how our budget will change when when our debts are paid off, which will start to happen in a few years. I really make no apologies for our budget for salaries. I think that investing in the people has worked well, and I am pleased with that for our community and the people who work for the town. I'm giving my thoughts, not laying out a plan, but you know, I want to listen carefully to what the Finance Committee has to say for how we need to prepare for the future. I like the idea of coming up with a percentage instead of 10 to begin with the end in mind, to say this is an acceptable increase that we could live with, and then start to
Tax
do
increase?
funding. Pardon me?
You're talking about tax increase?
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like the idea of saying this is our target for the tax increase, and then start looking at all of the fine-tuning ways that it can happen, but keeping intact, making sure that it's just operating expenses, not having an impact on our employees.
Okay. Thank you. Other thoughts? Carol?
So I guess for me, where I stand is having some sense of, as we discussed earlier, relative to the undesignated fund, to what was sort of left over, would give me better comfort at coming up with a number to allocate. In other words, trying to use what we know to come up with an allocation for the undesignated fund. So that would be the first thing. Then, for me, I would then look to the budget for fiscal year 26 and compare also expenditures in fiscal year 25 versus to what was budgeted. And when I did that a couple days ago, when Vika sent a spreadsheet that was on the link to the spreadsheet, for example, Public Works has a fiscal year 25 budgeted amount of $195,000. It's expended $137,000 at the end of April, which leaves a balance of $58,000 still remaining. So that would be one budget I would look at, you know, to see, in other words, we've expended 70% of the budget amount when we only have another month left. Then similarly for solid waste, we budgeted $241,000, but we have almost $90,000 left. Again, we've spent about a little over 60% of that budget by the end of April. which suggests to me, you know, maybe we've over budgeted. And those were the two that popped out to me as being, you know, kind of significant from where we budgeted. And then we have increases also included for going into fiscal year. So for example, there's a 17% increase in public works going into fiscal year 26, even though we haven't expended, you know, 70% of, 30% of the budget. And then for solid waste, we've got just a 2% increase there. And I did ask a couple questions on that one, and maybe he could, just so I could understand. So a couple big ticket items in that budget is chipping and brush, barging and hauling. And we have for example, the hauling is 60,000, even though we budgeted 95,000. So, you know, sort of how, and then the chipping, this must not be up to date, because the chipping has 3,000 expended when you budgeted 22.
Right.
So is there something missing there?
Yes, with the chipping, they haven't been paid yet, because there was an agreement that the chipping was going to be done for the budgeted number of 20,000. And after it was done, we received a check for 42. And so I've been back and forth with him trying to settle on a more appropriate number.
You mean an invoice for 42?
Yes.
And so they haven't been paid, check hasn't been cashed, which is why the expense for fiscal year 25 chipping is not accurately reflected in that yet, because.
So they have not yet been paid.
Yes, because we have not yet resolved.
And the
Well,
check's
so you
not.
haven't paid them even what we said we would pay them?
Correct.
But I guess what would help me then, because I thought this was up to date as best we could get. So maybe what we need is your best estimate of what we're gonna expend by the end of fiscal year 25, realistically. So I had assumed these numbers were pretty close, but is there any place else where we are?
They're as close as they are based on the expenses we've paid to date. There are outstanding things like with the chipping, that's the biggest one.
But for example, the hauling is a lot less than what we budgeted, so do you expect that to be, you know, so can we reduce that for fiscal year 26, or is?
So looking at the fiscal year 26, the cost between the hauling and the barging, the last couple of years, they really fluctuated, and so last fiscal year, the adjustments were made based on the anticipated increase in cost. And it was budgeted based on what the average number of hauls we've received over the previous 3 years. And so from the current year to fiscal year 26, that number was not adjusted. I think there's room, personally, I think in the next budget process, maybe combining the cost of the hauling and barging, or doing it a little bit differently in terms of how those numbers get tracked, because you're going up in some and down in others. And so you'll see for the barging currently is down from what the hauling and the barging should kind of align, but they haven't been the last, this current fiscal year.
Can you please explain the difference between hauling and barging?
So the hauling is physical vehicle cost of removing the dumpster. The barging is the cost of the vehicle, the dumpster on the barge. Yes, so it's a double.
But as an example of what I think Vika's talking about, if you take barging, the 2025 budget is 52,000. 2023 actual was 62,000. 2024 actual was 40,000. That's quite a bit of fluctuation in both directions. So similar fluctuations in barging, although not as dramatic. And those are both under. So I agree. I think these are good questions to ask, but I like the idea of asking the TA to take another look at some of these numbers and not try to budget each one of them so that we are certain we're not going to go over. I had a job once where I had to budget steel costs, and the first year I dramatically underestimated in my budget, and we got hammered with variances. The next year, I went the other direction and dramatically overestimated. The third year, I went to my boss and said, I screwed up 2 years in a row. I overestimated one year, I underestimated the next year. For this year, do you want me to estimate on the high side, or do you want me to estimate on the low side? And his answer was, I want you to estimate in the middle. So Vika, if you could do that. I don't know how to give any more direction. It's such a, some of these items are such a slippery piece of jello to try to nail to the wall, and yet, while we don't want to under budget and wind up having to go to a special town meeting, we also don't want to over budget and wind up with huge undesignated funds. Mark.
Thank you. I think in the first 10 years of the town, I think we over budgeted. That's what I felt like we did. I felt like we over budgeted. I think we were still trying to figure it out. We certainly didn't figure out how to plan very well for capital, and part of that was we had a very high rate on our debt service. Right out of the gate. It was almost 500 grand per year. So it was very hard for us. But here's my point. I really appreciate the fact that we are well underway with the finance committee, and we're looking hard at the future and present and the big ticket items that are going to come at us now and later. I don't think it's realistic for the town of Shebig and the select board to say we're going to go for no tax increase at all. I don't think that's going to work, just for the sheer sake of 2.8% index, whatever it is, 3.2, whatever the index is right now, inflation. And, you know, but I also don't think you should be handing 7 to 11% increases at the community on a consistent basis. I would like to suggest that you shoot for a 4 to 5% increase if you're going to have an increase. Thank you.
Carol, did you have more specific questions that you wanted to talk about?
No, and I guess to respond to Mark, I did sort of check around, and Vika probably can find the numbers better than I can, but I seem to see 5 to 7, Portland 7, that's the highest I saw, but most towns are in the 5 to 6%. It's just good benchmark, you know. I think we're a little different, and we might, what I'm also got in my mind is, you know, we may be looking at a recession and increased cost of living, and I just don't want to drive the year-round community off the island. So I think that's something that's important to me, but I also think this Stone Pier project needs to go ahead one way or the other with the no federal funding. We can't wait 5 years, I don't think. And it's also costing more money every year we wait, I think. So I think there's an urgency to get that done. So in terms of how we go from here, I'm happy to communicate my specific suggestions or comments, like I did to Vika already today with questions about where is this coming from. And I think we should all do that, not just me. And then, you know, Vika could come back with an adjusted budget, and I don't know if we want to hit a specific percentage target or not. I think it's easy to change the capital allocations. It's not difficult budget-wise, so to me, we can make that decision in a meeting. The other part for me is just what we're going to use comfortably for an undesignated fund you know, input, and I feel like I need a little more information before I can enforce the 175. And I think taking the, do we agree fiscal year '24 and seeing what was expended and what was left over, and could potentially come up with an estimate of fiscal year '25 too, but we did that before with Marjorie or something. I remember doing that in the past, and even in the current year, she came up with an approximation. She was pretty conservative, so she said, I'm pretty sure we're gonna have, I don't know, $60,000 left over or something. So, I mean, I would focus on '24, but it wouldn't hurt to look at '25, and then that could help inform because decisions about where we could make some adjustments. There are some safeguards built in with the overlay, we have a contingency. I will say when I went through this, the thing that also popped into my mind is there's no money in there for heat pumps for the town office, there's no money in there for Bennett's Cove construction, so we're in the process of doing design, submitting a permit, but we haven't allocated anything in fiscal year '26 to actually undertake a project. I'm assuming that these two parking projects, the Hook and Jenks Road, are both coming out of the storm adjustment account, but I don't have a good sense of what, maybe you have an estimate so you know what those costs are. But they're small comparatively, but they're still costs that we have to, I think we're committed to doing those
I think the Hook was 15K.
for the contractor to construct it. So I want to know what those are, just so we make sure we have enough money in that account.
I don't think we have any numbers yet for the Jenks Road parking reallotment, and the amount in the storm damage account right now is just under 80,000.
How much?
Just under 80, 79,000.
But that's an account, I do think we want.
There are some, that is an account, that's the number that we have, but there are some things that we've allocated.
That are gonna come out of that.
Yes, yep.
And that's the storm
Yes.
damage.
The storm damage and
Thank you.
restoration,
Yeah.
or, you know.
Got it.
What else is coming
Carol,
out?
Carol, you touched on tax impact, not just this year, but in the years ahead. One item that's on our list of future agenda items that we haven't gotten around to talking about yet is some sort of circuit breaker, local tax abatement program that would be aimed at reducing the impact on lower income households. I think that's worth taking a look at in the near future.
So I agreed to research that, and I did. So most of the towns around us have something. All of them have income thresholds, some are higher than others, there's quite a range, I was sort of surprised, so I don't know how they come up with those numbers, because the different towns have different, if you make a certain, you have to be a certain age, and then you have to meet a certain income threshold, below a certain income threshold. And Cumberland and Yarmouth are different, for example, but the state has 3 different programs that people can avail themselves of, and one of them is similar to the one Chip said, where you could literally get a tax abatement. In other words, when your estate changes hands, that's when those taxes get paid. So if somebody was really in a jam and was worried about losing their property, that could be a solution, so they could really reduce their taxes, and those taxes get paid when the property is transferred. So I think what I would suggest right now is that we sort of make that information available, you know, to the public in a more proactive way. And then I think working with the finance committee, you know, I do think it's something we need to address, but when you look at the number of residents in this community over 65 or 67, it's a lot, so then you gotta figure out what can we afford, and maybe we have to make the income threshold lower to really kind of make it. I don't know, I think it's not a simple thing for Shabbat because our median age is like 65 or something crazy. So I think we should do something. I think it's probably a small portion of the community that would need it, but I think and then I think when we do reevaluation, it's hard to know how that will all pan out, but it could, my sense is the interior parcels are gonna get hit pretty hard too, just given what the house next to us sold for. So I do think, you know, I think right now I would wait, but I would have the plan, start working towards a plan, and that's something on the town side.
And then in terms of how we move forward, I think what we've talked about is asking the town administrator to go back through the budget and look for areas where we can tighten up in the operational budget. Do we want, as a board, to set a target, the tax increase as a result of this proposed budget of no more than X%? Can we come up with that number tonight so that the TA and all of us working one-on-one, working in our own minds, have a target that we're shooting toward? Dave?
Yeah, I like Mark's number. 5% I think is fair, given what's happening in the world, what's happening with us over time. We've done a pretty good job, I think, of holding the line, and you can only hold it so long before it breaks. And I think 5% is, maybe 4%, but 5% I think is a good target.
Oh, I said, yeah.
I'd say 5 to 6% when I look at some of the, the fact that wages have gone up, and I think that is important to invest. So I would say 5 to 6%.
Carol, do you want to put a number on
Yeah,
that?
given that the consumer price index, we're using 3%, instead, previously we've been using closer to 2 or 2.5, I would go to 6%. Potentially, 5 to 6%, I would agree, but maybe try to keep it under 6. I feel like how much we're gonna put in, there's a two-part question here for me, the undesignated fund versus, so if you can do, I'm not sure of the direction from me is reduce the budget to that amount, because I feel like I gotta know what the undesignated fund transfer can be, so it's two things.
Richard?
Yeah, I would go along with this 5 to 6%. I mean, 5% sounds good, but 6 variable. And I really like the idea of promoting these circuit breaker type ideas. That will help, I think, calm the anger from the community. It would help with preserving one of our big goals here, which is the young working families, keeping them on the island, and older people who can barely afford their retirement now. I think that would go a long way. And the rest of the island can probably stomach that 5 to 6% without hitting it won't affect their daily lives as much. That's just an impression. So, but protecting the lower end is great. I didn't know we're able to do that kind of thing.
Well, the state has that.
The state allows us.
So people have to, they have to, for all of those programs, people have to provide their income and asset information, and a lot of people don't like doing that.
Yeah.
And so that's,
If we can make it easy for them to do that somehow.
I will say, if I was thinking back to the survey Eliza Jane did, and if I was the town citizen sitting, even a year-round person, I'd be like, my taxes are going up 5%, the stone pier is still a mess. Like, when are you gonna fix that thing? And so I think we have to address where we're at on that project and kind of the progress that we perceive we're gonna make. Because that's how I would feel out of nothing. And I think to the public, it feels like nothing's happened. And definitely people have been complaining to me, like, you guys just don't get, even in the meeting we had just this week, you don't get anything done. It's been 3 years and I'm waiting, right?
Yeah.
And so Stone Pier, I hear that on a lot of things, and it does take a long time. And, so other wild cards in the picture is the FEMA money. Like, hopefully we're gonna get that, but I think we have to explain to people the federal funding sources are very iffy. And so we still have to make repairs even if we don't get the FEMA money, so we have to do something. So I think our presentation to the community needs to be thoughtful. And I also would hope that you know, the rest of the board will really look at the budget closely and ask questions about, to Vika, about the areas where you think we, you know, either make suggestions or questions so that you're comfortable with the amount we're asking for is, you know, necessary. I mean, it's the select board's responsibility to approve the budget and bring it to the voters. It's not Vika's responsibility.
So I would like to say 5%. I'd like to hold it at 5. I like Mark's idea of 4 to 5. Ranges don't really get as much. The top end is what you wind up with unless you're careful. So I'd like to say no more than 5%. That's my goal. I agree with Carol, we need more information on what to use for an undesignated fund balance number. I think the formula that Vika's been given from Marjorie, from the auditors, and from other TAs is worth looking at, but I like the idea of looking at what our actual versus budget for both revenue and expense was for 2024 as a guiding number to see how we performed on budget versus actual that year. And if we can do that quickly, then I think we can come back. I think next week's meeting needs to be almost entirely focused on this budget conversation. We'll try to keep the other agenda items to a minimum. There may be a few things that we have to talk about, but we'll try to keep it all on budget. So, anything else from your end, Vika?
I mean, the only thing I will ask is if you as a board going to provide me any information or ask questions, so it's Wednesday. Do we try to get the packet up by noon time on Friday? It never works. So with these changes, I can already foresee that there is no way we're gonna have all of this information collected, compiled, added into the Trio system, and updated to generate all the new numbers, and to have the agenda with whatever items. You know, things are gonna happen. I wanted to get this information to you by noon time today. It was 3:30 by the time it happened. So if you do have things, I mean, I know you all have your own lives, but try to get that to me as soon as you're able to. So then I can try to get it to you at a reasonable time, so then you have time to look at it. Because it's, you know, it's a week between now and next meeting, and we need to have this information. I mean, we don't have to have it, the packet information posted to the general public, but the agenda and the rest of the information with 3 days in
Okay, we'll get the
advance.
agenda up by Friday, and let's make a target of getting the budget questions to you by Friday so that we can get the budget up on the packet by Monday, noon. Is that a reasonable target?
I guess the point I'm trying to make is the later I get information from you, the later it's going to be before I can generate the information back to me. And
So give us a specific date.
this is, I mean, if you can get the information to me by the end of the day tomorrow, that would be ideal, because then I can work on that information and get it all together on Friday. And if it doesn't happen, still get it to you on Monday. But I would like to avoid that, seeing as this is, you know, we are kind of in the final stages of this. The goal is to have next Wednesday, you be at a comfortable place that then I can take that information and put it into a warrant and then send it to the attorney, and then in 2 weeks, have that done, have the attorney look at it, and have that in front of you to look at. So turnaround window is tight. And every year it seems to be.
Well,
And what is the best way to communicate questions? Is it, you know, asking about a line item and what the question is? Would it be color coding this copy? What's the most efficient way to look at those changes or ask those questions for you?
So what Carol did today in an email is perfectly
That was
fine.
good format.
Yeah, if,
And
you
I would
know,
ask
if you
that-
have a question about every single line item,
No,
I would
no.
suggest come in and talk to me. That might be a lot quicker to go through it.
Yep.
But I think email's fine.
I think it would be helpful to email the whole board, just so we don't
yeah.
No
duplicate
repetitive.
effort. And I also think if there are, you know, like Bennett's Cove to me is like, we don't have any money set aside for that, and I don't know where, you know, I'm sure that's a pretty big chunk. But you're gonna be in the next 6 months where you're either gonna be able to go forward with something at Bennett's Cove, or we're going to have to find another solution. And I do think the other part that we've been all talking about, with the whole parking enforcement thing, so we have these 2 new parking spaces we're gonna make. I think we really need to think differently about the parking enforcement, at least in the summertime, and I think, again, I'd suggest a temporary person in the summer to do daytime parking enforcement or something. Or maybe Bob, but I just feel like we need a plan, because I think it's gonna take a while to change people's practices. And we do have a special town meeting coming up, I guess, probably in August, to deal with the floodplain maps. And so if there's some uncertainty about something, we could potentially wait till then, and let's hope we have an undesignated fund balance by then, and we could potentially, you know, take steps to fund something that we know more, that we have, you know, when we feel more confident.
So you're saying if we took a conservative approach to the fund balance for this budget, and then by August, we know that it could have been bigger, we could add money to expense or to capital or whatever.
I think that's right, and or if we, for example, Bennett's Code, maybe
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
when we deal with it, we probably have a better sense of what it might
It'd
cost.
be hard to budget for Bennett's right now because we have no idea what a plan is or what, therefore, the cost would be.
But for example, then the other thing that came to mind were these heat pumps, and I forget what the cost was for the town, but do we have a fund that was gonna come out of?
The heat pumps is one item that I know will be on the agenda next week. We do not have a fund that I'm aware of other than the building fund. We have a reserve account for buildings. The heat pumps could come out of that. I don't,
I can tell you.
but I don't know what, I think the total heat pumps for the town is something like 50, something like that.
But then there was repair of the furnace too, right?
That was much, much less than anticipated.
It wasn't a lot, but I just, again, it's like one of those expenses we don't wanna forget about, because it's not 50,000, it's not.
Building expenses has the building fund has 92,000.
So according to Ellie today, the cost of the, total cost of the project is $186,000 with a $53,000 funds coming from efficiency main. So we're talking about 120.
Is that the town or is that the town and the school?
The town and the school.
Oh, okay.
Correct, yes.
Still a lot of money.
It's still a lot. The
And,
school is much larger than the town. It's a much more complicated system.
and the other thing I think, when are we supposed to make our presentation to the community?
May 14th, yeah.
Really? So we have to prepare for that, folks, and the other thing
That's
that
right after we finalize the budget on May 7th.
But I think one thing that I feel is, I'm sure it's not intentional by the school, but their operational budget is not going, I mean, there is a decrease in their budget because of the bond being paid off, but it's not a decrease in the operational budget. In fact, I think it's going up. And so I just feel like, in full disclosure to the community, because then we go and count that kind of in the bond, in sort of our bond capacity down the line. And to me, it's a little deceptive to sort of say, oh, our budget's going down 8%, but by the way, we're gonna have more bond capacity. Because you're kind of double counting at that.
I don't remember, can you say that again?
I don't know, so basically, for whatever reason, the ransom to get out of SAB 51 bond was actually in the school budget. So we paid that for 20 years in the school budget. We're gonna pay it off in this coming year. So the next fiscal year 26, there's no payment for the bond because it's been paid off. So the school budget gives the appearance of going down, even though the actual cost to operate the school, what we think of as the operational budget, is actually going up slightly. The overall budget, because of the absence of the bond payment, is going down. But when the finance committee figured out what our bonding capacity is, they took that, you know, the fact that we've paid off that bond and added it to our capacity. In other words, now we don't have that, we can borrow this much money. But if you do that, then you can't really say the school budget's going down because they're already counting it in the debt side. And so and for whatever reason, if we had now the school construction bond is actually in the municipal debt to service, so it was because they're in two different places. So I think and I did hear the school committee say at our meeting that, you know, we're going down 8% or something, but I don't think that's
why I was confused with my question when I asked them.
I would like to have this conversation when they're in the room, but it got to be appropriate.
Could I ask a couple very quick questions? So in a scenario, if the taxes were to go up 5% for the community of Shebang Island, and I realize that when your taxes go up, it's based on your value and the mill rate. But for simple math reasons, if someone right now is paying $10,000 a year in property taxes, wouldn't they roughly have a $500 increase on their tax bill in that scenario? Here's my second question, and I kind of should know the answer to this, so I apologize. When would we expect the assessors to attach a total value to our town, and then we do the tax calculation sheet to actually have them tell us what the suggested mill rate will be? What month will that be happening in, you think? July?
So I have access to that information now, and I use that information to provide an estimate, but those numbers change based on every month when they're here and they update. And so the numbers don't become, you know, as close to accurate until we're ready to commit. And so in August, we set up a time to meet where we then look at the budget and what was adopted and plug those numbers in. But I started the last couple of weeks putting the information in. It's not gonna have a significant change over the next couple of months because they know of our process, but there might be a slight change.
The only reason I'm asking that question really is our tax rate currently $950 per $1,000 of value? Is that accurate?
10.72.
Sorry, I went up. Okay, so 10.72 is, you know, because if your value goes up and the mill rate goes up.
So what's happened in some towns is when they've done the revaluations, people's relative valuations have gone up enough that it's been, you know, they've ended up with pretty big increases when you try to equalize them over the community. And I fear that could happen here. And I think so, and I don't know what our schedule is for revaluation. It wouldn't be next year, the year after. Is that what you're looking at?
Couple of years out, didn't you say?
So, yeah, the tax assessor and I met within the last within the last couple of weeks and had this conversation and said, so at this point we are looking probably about 2 years out. They did recommend an additional $10,000 in the reserve account, which is in there, and recommended that after we get through the budget process, put out an RFQ and start advertising it and start getting somebody on board based on their expertise and their suggestion. If we start the process, late summer to fall advertising, that it'd probably be about 2 years before they can start, or whoever ends up.
But am I correct in saying, you guys will know better than I do because I'm new at this, but when there's a reevaluation, some people go up, some people go down, but the net stays the same unless the town's budget changes. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and could I build on that, because the rule of thumb that I've heard, and we've been through this a few times, 10 or a quarter will have higher valuations, a quarter will have lower valuations, and the final quarter stays roughly the same. So it scares the hell out of people.
That sounds like a 25% tax reduction.
That's the point. Revaluations scare the hell out of people, but the fact of the matter is, unless you're in that last 1/3, your taxes are either gonna be steady or they're actually go down.
And then they take a look at what you have budgeted to run your municipal and your school, and then they make a recommendation of mill rate.
Right.
Okay. Any closing comments from the board? I think we've got our work in front of us to quickly get any questions that we have relative to the operating budget. And Vika's gonna work on looking at fiscal year 2024 expense and income budget versus actual. Yeah. Carol.
So for the next meeting, which is a week from now, and it's our final budget meeting, I would ask that we bring printouts of the budget for the public and make sure it's online for them to see, but also, have printouts, because I think not everybody's gonna come in with a computer, so, I think that's reasonable. Not enough for 100 people, but 10 copies or something.
Right. Final comments from the public? Okay, thank you all so much for the comments. Would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Take care of the budget.
Motion by Richard.
It's a workshop.